Hello, everyone. Before we get started, I'll just begin by sharing a couple of procedural things. You'll notice that the chat function has been disabled. However, throughout the presentation, please use our Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, to pose any questions to our speaker. You can either reserve your questions to the end or pose them throughout, and our speaker, Kara, will get to them as she concludes her webinar. If you run into any technical issues, you can also use the Q&A throughout the presentation to reach myself and my amazing colleague Jason, who are here in the background. We'll also make sure to carve out some time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions that you've posed for Kira. When the webinar concludes, there will also be a QR code on your screen and a link in the chat for a survey that we hope you'll fill out to let us know what you liked and what you'd like to see in future webinars. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to Ava's YouTube channel shortly, so you can revisit and share this webinar and any of our previous webinars. In just a moment, I'll put that link in the chat. Without further ado, welcome to the Alliance Against Violence and Adversity's Webinar Wednesdays. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yursich. With Ava, I'm an early career researcher and lead on the webinar series alongside my amazing colleagues, Jason, Andrea, and Isra. Outside of that role, I'm the co-director of the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children, housed in the School of Criminology at Simon Fraser University, and faculty in the School of Social Sciences at Capilano University. I'm joining you today from the unceded, traditional, and ancestral territory of the Coquitlam First Nation. And on behalf of AVA, which is a national organization, I want to begin by acknowledging that we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples on the lands on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. The focus of today's webinar is understanding the impact. Recognize the impacts of your work and the signs of strain or burnout. And we are joined by Kira Snodgrass of Calgary Communities Against Sexual Assault, or CASA. Kira is a sexual violence educator with CASA, and her role has allowed her the opportunity to follow her passion for providing education and training on topics related to sexual violence and providing support for those who have been impacted by sexual violence when aiding on CASA's support and information line. Kira has also become a certified facilitator of first responder to sexual assault and abuse training through the Alberta Association of Sexual Assault Services. Kira, thank you for joining us again today. I very much look forward to your webinar.
Thank you very much. All right, folks, and thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. So as mentioned today, if my mouse will work, we are going to be talking about recognizing the impacts of your work and of strain or burnout. So just really being able to focus on noticing those signs, understanding what strain and burnout is. Hopefully, if you don't already have a decent understanding of it, you will by the end of today. Okay, so just to start with a bit of a reflection. So most of you, if not all of you joining today, work in a helping or supporting role. So regardless of our role, I think we can all probably agree that within this space, we all like to help others. So just to center this conversation, I'll pose a few questions about your work, just to inspire some reflection for you to, I guess, chew on as we move on throughout our content today. So the first question, and just feel free to jot these down, refer back to them as needed as we continue. What keeps you interested in your work? And what is the best aspect of your job? Just something that maybe you continuously look forward to every day, every month, every year. And can you describe an inspiring moment that you've had in your work? And lastly, what keeps you going when times are hard? Because we all know, regardless of how much we love our jobs, that we go through those tough times at work, whether it's with different changes, interactions with clients or patients, and that sort of thing. So just take a moment to reflect on those and feel free to jot down some thoughts and keep those answers front of mind just as we move throughout the content. The goal is to really just start with holding the positives of your work in mind before we move into exploring some of the factors that can make it hard to sit with those positives. Because the overall goal of this presentation or of this conversation is to assist you in understanding the ways that the terms we're about to discuss influence your job satisfaction and overall your outlook on the world as well. So, burnout. I feel like this is probably something that we're all very familiar with. We're probably very familiar with this term. We often, I think, confuse the concept of burnout with secondary or vicarious trauma, but they're two separate things. Now, of course, they can be experienced within the same role, may even experience burnout or often experience burnout prior to maybe being impacted by vicarious trauma, but they are different. So, burnout is a term used to describe physical and mental and emotional exhaustion that we can experience when we are feeling consistently overwhelmed day to day with little to no reprieve. And even then, a lot of the time when we think of burnout, we think of workplace burnout. We can feel burnout in our day-to-day lives. Whether it's from, if you recently bought a home and you're discovering all these things wrong that you have to fix, or you're just experiencing a lot of stress from family, or maybe you are doing a kitchen renovation that is never ending. Those things can cause burnout in our personal lives. But just generally speaking, burnout is typically more associated with work or like intense caregiving. So as noted here, burnout is stress and frustration caused by the workplace. So it's possible in any occupation. I do feel like in helping or like person-centered occupations, typically we talk about burnout more. We're more aware of it, but it is possible regardless of the job. It is simpler to address than secondary trauma. Doesn't mean it feels that way at the time. It can feel very exhausting. It can feel like there's not really a way of coming back from that burnout, but it is simpler to address. Where burnout does kind of differ from secondary or vicarious trauma is that it's not damaging to our view of the world. And we will explore that piece a little bit more in the next slide. And it is also not the primary cause of empathic strain. Again, we'll explore empathic strain a little bit further in, but empathic strain can really just come about from repeated efforts of empathy towards someone and their situation, and that it does not necessarily, that's not necessarily caused by burnout. Okay, so secondary and vicarious trauma. So it describes the profound shift in worldview that occurs in helping professionals when they work with individuals who have experienced trauma. Helpers notice that their fundamental beliefs about the world are altered and possibly damaged by being repeatedly exposed to traumatic material. So while we can see from the definition here that while there can be similar symptoms with burnout and vicarious trauma has more severity in its impact. Now, if you're wondering about the difference between like trauma or PTSD and vicarious trauma, PTSD or just direct trauma results from something that is directly experienced, while vicarious trauma results from something that is indirectly experienced. I once heard someone explain it in a way that vicarious trauma differs from post-traumatic stress in the sense that the trauma is not directly experienced, it's more absorbed. So we're picking up on that trauma from someone else or from maybe reviewing like different video, audio, photo material that is of traumatic senses. So in the workplace, someone could experience PTSD from a direct experience, but especially in helping professions, we often experience retellings of traumatic events. And like I said, maybe we even see pictures, video, or hear audio. And that's where we can experience that vicarious trauma. So again, looking at it more as indirect exposure as opposed to direct exposure to traumatic material. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some potential indicators of secondary or vicarious trauma. These are some of the common impacts or indicators of vicarious trauma, and I'll go through the list for the categories here, but please note that these lists are not exhaustive. As I'm sure we all know, trauma is experienced by everyone differently, and therefore the indicators and impacts will look different from person to person. But these lists are some of the common or more common ones, I should say, just to help us have an idea of what to look out for, not only for ourselves, but also for others. So first, under the category of physical, we have exhaustion. So kind of that level of tiredness or just feeling completely drained that isn't recharged by getting a good night's sleep or taking that time to rest. Insomnia, headaches and migraines, or an increase in headaches and migraines, because I know that's still a common one for people to experience regardless. Increased susceptibility to illness. So maybe just getting sick more frequently. I know that can be difficult kind of depending on the season of life. You might be exposed to more germs, so that can be a tougher one to catch. But just noticing that maybe your immune system is a bit weakened. Sore back and neck, or even just like upper body area, just having that tension, and that can also cause headaches as well. GI distress, rashes and breakouts, grinding your teeth at night, or maybe even just finding yourself clenching your jaw quite a bit throughout the day or at night as well. Heart palpitations, or just kind of general chest pain, and hypochondria. When we're talking about behavioral, we could see increased use in alcohol and drugs. So again, when we're speaking of increased use, this does look different person to person, kind of dependent on what your baseline is. But just knowing that general increase, and maybe there's not even an increase in the direct use because maybe you catch yourself, you're like, oh, do I really need to have a drink or anything like that? But maybe you're just noticing that there's like more of a desire to engage in substance use. Anger and irritability at home or at work. So just in your personal life and your professional life, maybe noticing that you have a bit of a shorter fuse. You're just not really feeling like you have a lot of patience, and you're just noticing that you're a bit more irritable and quicker to anger. Avoidance of clients and patients. This could be maybe not even just the client or the patient that maybe was connected to the vicarious trauma, but it could be anyone that has kind of a similar experience. I know at CASA, of course, we work with folks who have experienced sexual violence. So essentially all of our clients that we see have experienced sexual violence. But maybe for someone, if they've kind of experienced that level of vicarious trauma when working with a client, maybe they have another client that has a similar experiences, or their experiences of sexual violence kind of correlate a little bit more. And so there might be some avoidance there. Watching excessive amounts of TV or like Netflix movies at night. This one is difficult because again, it depends on the person. It really depends on how much TV or movies that you watch in your day to day, but just noticing an increase of that. Maybe it's something where, you used to take the dog for a walk at night, and now you are not doing that and only watching TV or something like that. So just noticing kind of that increase, or what seems excessive from your baseline because everyone is different. Doom scrolling could be another one. I think we all have maybe engaged in that a time or two ourselves, but just kind of noticing that that is just becomes excessive, and really starts to take away from the time you have to pour into other aspects of your life. Feeling helpless when hearing a difficult client story. I know this one can be a little bit, I don't want to say confusing, but maybe a little bit tough because ultimately speaking, I think we've probably all heard something from a client where we feel helpless in the sense that we want to just kind of really be able to help them through it, fix it for them right away. And that's obviously just not something we can do. But this would kind of be outside again of that normal baseline. Problems in personal relationships. Again, that can come from that anger or irritability that we mentioned, but it can just be overall problems in those relationships, maybe difficulty with communication, difficulty with sharing emotion, with making time for other people as well. That can definitely be something too. Engaging in frequent negative gossiping or venting at work. This can be a tough one, and it really just kind of causes that challenge to fester, really, right? It doesn't really do anything productive, but people might find themselves in that pattern, and that can be a tough thing to break out of. Impaired appetite or binge eating. So again, looking at something that is outside of the norm. If someone maybe finds themselves to be a bit more of an emotional eater, just in day to day, but they notice that that has been kicked up a couple notches, that can be a sign for sure, or sorry, an indicator. Or if someone maybe usually has a fairly healthy appetite, never really has any issues with it, and suddenly is noticing that they just don't have much of an appetite anymore. That can definitely be a potential indicator. And next, under emotional, and I should have highlighted this before, you'll notice there's some overlap between categories, but difficulty sleeping or potential nightmares, dreaming about work, dreaming about the situation, that can definitely be a factor that comes in. Feelings of hopelessness. So this can be connected a little bit to that general overview of vicarious trauma impacting our view of the world and kind of the way that we see our position within it. That can also incite that level of hopelessness, but maybe we also feel hopeless, that level of hopelessness for the people that we're helping too, right? Emotional exhaustion. So again, just not really being able to recharge. Depression or anxiety as well, guilt, depersonalization, so spacing out during work or on the drive home. Honestly, I think probably a lot of us could say that maybe we've had a time where we've gotten home and we're like, oh, I kind of spaced out there on my way home. That's not completely uncommon, but again, just noticing that happening more, right? Kind of an increase in that, especially for spacing out during work. Um, I feel like, again, and I might just be ratting myself out here, but I feel like we have all probably had an interaction with a client or a patient where we have maybe had a moment where we kind of space out, lose our train of thought. Maybe we didn't have our morning coffee. But again, this would be noticing that at like more of a abnormal amount of occurrences. Disruption of worldview and heightened anxiety or irrational fears. So something that I want to highlight with this one is I think especially since the COVID pandemic, this one has been a little bit more prevalent for folks because I do think during that time we probably all experienced disruption of our worldview, heightened anxiety, and fears that I don't think were irrational, but maybe we took them to an irrational spot. So I do think, especially in the climate of today, everything that we do have going on, this can be something that we just feel day to day. Maybe we even feel a little bit of burnout from reading the news or watching the news. But this again would be an increase of that. Specifically when we think of the sexual violence sector, because again, CASA is the sexual assault center for Calgary. When we think of that, it could just be that we just view the world in a whole blanket of sexual violence. And we really apply that and view it as like heightened anxiety around that topic or irrational fears surrounding that. Maybe we become very nervous of us experiencing something or those that we love. Next is difficulty separating personal and professional lives. I feel like a lot of people who are in the helping profession are guilty of this one sometimes because I do think sometimes it is hard, especially when we are hearing from folks some of the really hard things that they've gone through. It's hard to not integrate that into our personal lives, right? Even from an education standpoint, for me, I know when I'm facilitating on topics related to sexual violence, a lot of the time you draw on real life examples. So either things you have read, things that someone you know has experienced, you kind of relate it back to your life, because that's the way that we engage with the world, is relating it back to what we know and what our experiences are. And that can be tough too. But again, having a harder time separating that personal and professional life, and even not really being able to mentally remove yourself from work when you go home. Intrusive imagery. If you are someone who has a bit more of an active imagination, maybe it could be something where, based on an experience that a client has shared with you, you're having some intrusive imagery based on that. Or, like I said in the previous slide, if you were exposed to traumatic videos, photos, audio, that might be coming up in your head kind of on a bit of a replay. And next is feeling responsible for clients. So for that one, I know that that probably feels a little bit confusing, because depending on our role, we can have a responsibility to our clients to provide them tools, resources, support, just kind of help them navigate what they have going on. And that can mean that perhaps outside of our time with clients, we may worry for them. Maybe we have a quick thought of, oh, I hope they're doing okay. They seemed really upset in our session today or yesterday. But feeling responsible for clients could be where we see that shift of almost embodying or taking on their challenges, feeling responsible for it. So feeling like we have to address it or carry them through it, as opposed to supporting them through it, and providing those resources for them as well in that professional capacity. So that can definitely be a common one, and that can be hard to try and avoid. That can be a difficult thing. I do think, especially when people are new in the helping field, that becomes one that they have to be very intentional about spending time navigating and learning how to not take that home with them. But again, those are just some of the common potential indicators of vicarious trauma. We might see these in our day-to-day within work. Doesn't mean that we have vicarious trauma, but these are just some of those good indicators to look out for. And we'll talk a little bit more throughout our time together about maybe some protective factors as well. Okay, so this video is called The Edge of Compassion. It's actually a full length. I think it's about 20 minutes. So we're not going to watch 20 minutes. We're going to watch, I think, the first 3 or so minutes. I just really enjoy how she frames essentially empathic strain, which will lead us into our next slide. But I will go ahead and play the first couple minutes of that now. And again, the info is just right here if this is something that you would like to watch the full video of after our time together today.
Have you ever had a friend who went through the world's longest ever breakup? And the first time or 2 or 3, you were totally there for them. You're like, you call me anytime. Forget about that guy, that girl, forget about that person. I got you. And then they went back 5, 6, 7 times. And then something shifted inside of you, and instead of being like, I got you, you call me, you noticed that something changed. And all of a sudden, you started screening their calls and kind of having this shift in your ability to feel empathy or compassion for them. Can you relate to this? Now, the truth is that we're all compassionate in a different way. Some of us have a huge pool of compassion. We are the go-to for our loved ones, our friends, and some of us have quite a small tank of compassion, and most people maybe don't go to us very often. So it's not kind of a metric that everyone has in the same way. But I became really interested in this idea of emotional depletion towards people who are experiencing pain or suffering or chronic illness. And I became interested in this in my profession and also as a result of working at Queen's University. So I was a crisis counselor at Queen's University for about 7 years, and I also worked with the military for 10 years. And I'm a trauma specialist and I'm a psychotherapist. And I started noticing a shift in people's energy and ability to be present for other people. But first of all, in their personal lives and also in our professional lives, if that's what we do for a living. And so I started asking myself some years ago, is there a sweet spot between caring just the right amount and not caring at all? So I started researching this. I've been in the field of crisis and trauma for over 20 some years. And about 15 or 16 years ago, something happened that made me kind of pause. So I was working at Queen's University at the time, and I was starting to see a lot of burnt out students, a lot of burnt out residence dons. I had a couple of residence dons that at some point lost their entire year because they were helping so many students who were suicidal or in crisis. And I started to think, where is it that we failed to teach people about boundaries and limits? And how do we get kind of swallowed up into other people's pain and suffering? And is there a different way to do that? I also started seeing a lot of housemates, and maybe you've been through this, where one person in the house is suffering from a mental illness or a legitimate crisis, and the entire house becomes consumed with this person's problem or issue at the cost of their own suffering. So that's the first thing that made me pause, was basically watching.
Okay, sorry folks. I feel like I paused it just when it was getting good, but so what I really like about that video is it frames it in a very relatable way, I think, of that friends break up and how you're showing up for them, and they keep getting back together with them, and then they break up and you keep showing up, and then we lose that ability to show up for them over time. And how we can experience that empathic strain when we struggle to balance that level of compassion we give others while maintaining our own well-being. And I think that that is something that is easier said than done in terms of being able to balance the two, but it is just good general food for thought on how we can care for ourselves by maintaining those boundaries and knowing our limits, and how we can in how that in turn can make us even better at being able to show up for others and for ourselves. But like she said, it's that balance of help, or not that balance, that lack of balance when we're helping too much. And I feel like probably a lot of us have had moments where we feel like we're helping too much. We lose sight of being able to put ourselves first, and then all of a sudden we're feeling like we have nothing in the tank, we have nothing to give. And sometimes that could come out of left field for other people, right? Because if we're always that person that shows up every time, and we're always able to do it, and then that one time we're like, no, I've got nothing left for you, it can seem very out of the blue for them. But it's kind of been that slow burn of empathic strain or compassion fatigue for us. Which brings me into the next slide. So empathic strain. Let me go through that definition a bit. So it can also be referred to as compassion fatigue. I feel like that's a bit more common, but for the purpose of this, I'll refer to it as empathic strain. So that concept was introduced in that video, but I'll just kind of go over it again. So it's the lessening of the ability to hold compassion over time because of repeated exposure to overwhelming, in this case, traumatic material, but frankly, just overwhelming material in general. So like she said, the friend who's going through the same breakup every other week or something. So this is a very common thing to experience, both personally and professionally, especially in the helping profession. It's often described as the cost of caring, which I believe she had also mentioned in that video. This is something that honestly often is unavoidable. I do think we develop an ability to kind of guard ourselves from empathic strain over time. But I do feel like, especially in the helping profession, we've all gone through this at least once, and maybe we've gone through it in our personal lives too. But like I said, this can be unavoidable sometimes because there are other factors that play into it too. Because for the most part, we all have lives outside of work, as well that can compound with work factors and put us at an increased risk of experiencing empathic strain or even sometimes burnout or vicarious trauma. So if we're helping someone through something at work, maybe we have a client that we're helping them process something, and then we go home and we're helping someone in our life process something similar, it can just be tough, right? So that's what I mean about sometimes, unfortunately, it can be unavoidable. But I do think as we increase our own capacity, it becomes, I don't want to say more and more avoidable, but it becomes something that we can typically catch before we experience a true empathic strain. Okay, so in terms of essentially kind of increased risk of forming or experiencing vicarious trauma or maybe burnout or empathic strain. As you can see here, there are a lot of different factors that can increase risk of vicarious trauma, including experiencing empathic strain itself. So I'll go through the different elements here just to provide a little bit more color to how and why these factors can increase risk. So for personal vulnerabilities, other life stressors, personal history, coping style and strategies or lack thereof, and personality characteristics can contribute to this. They can also potentially be protective factors, but in this, they can potentially increase that risk. Work-related trauma or grief and loss, or traumatic events in the workplace. So that can be like death of a colleague, critical incident, maybe loss of a client or patient. It could also even be something like funding cuts. A lot of folks who work within, whether actually it's like provincial or federal roles or nonprofits, experience funding cuts, and that can create a level of background stress, right? Especially maybe if we're in a contract role and we're not sure if that contract's going to get renewed, it can just have a little bit more of that impact on our day to day. So we could have direct exposure or primary trauma, so traumatic events that happen directly to you as an individual. Over half of helping professionals have a history of trauma themselves, and potential impact of this on their work can potentially make them more vulnerable to vicarious trauma. Work-related exposure can be a factor as well, as mentioned before. Unfortunately, just because we are helping professionals does not mean we are immune to experiencing trauma ourselves, which we may have experienced prior to even entering our field or that we may experience in our time working. And also we can experience that indirect trauma within the workplace too. Empathic strain or compassion fatigue, that can also just make us more susceptible to experiencing that secondary trauma. Systems failure is another one. This is a big one in my opinion, but the impact of gaps and barriers in the systems that we work with or within. So maybe being angry or frustrated at the lack of resources or disagreeing about someone's eligibility for services. Maybe we have a client where we feel like a service would greatly benefit them, but they're not eligible. That can be incredibly frustrating. It can kind of make you feel like maybe you're failing or there's a gap in your ability to provide support. And this can result in moral distress. So when our values conflict with the rules and regulations, and we maybe disagree with or are morally opposed to what we were told to do, right? So again, maybe we are trying to get a client into a housing program, but they don't qualify. That can be very tough for us, right? That can be something that is that causes a lot of moral distress. Working conditions. So working conditions profoundly impact our workplace relationships, that sense of trust, quality of communication, workload, who we report to, overall workplace climate, recognition, all those things. Those can be factors too. Again, they can be something that increase our risk, or they can actually be something that decrease our risk of potentially experiencing vicarious trauma. Sociocultural context. So the sociocultural context of the community, province, or country we live in can profoundly impact our daily levels of stress, especially when that context contradicts with our own personal values, morals, or cultural practices. I think this is probably something, unfortunately, a lot of people are experiencing in this current climate. And again, that can just be an increased risk factor. So now that we've gotten a bit of a better sense of some of the risk factors, and maybe now that we feel a little bit hopeless, I apologize for that. Sometimes when we're trying to express the severity of a potential issue, there's a little bit of that hopelessness there. But we'll explore some of the factors that can increase resilience and buffer the effects or impacts of secondary trauma. So I promise it'll get a little less bleak in the next slide here. Okay. So some protective factors and resilience in the workplace specifically. So again, not an exhaustive list of workplace protective factors that help to prevent or address the impacts of this work. And some are dependent on the specific context and environment that you work in as personal factors too. So compassion satisfaction is first. This is pleasure, fulfillment, and positive emotional award that comes from helping others. I'm sure this is something that we've probably all experienced, and going back on the reflection questions that I've posed earlier, maybe this is what keeps you interested in your work, or maybe it is the best, most rewarding aspect of your job. So some examples of this could be professional fulfillment. So similar to what I've already mentioned, it can be that rewarding feeling of making a difference or having that impact. Altruism or purpose can also just be deriving that joy from being able to help and support, contributing to the greater good, right? After that, we have continued professional development. So growing as a professional in terms of knowledge, experience, and tools, as well as growing professionally in both our abilities and increasing our own window of tolerance with work-related topics or subject matter. So not to be confused with becoming numb to the subject matter or experiencing compassion fatigue, but truly being able to have our own capacity for our work grow and have that window of tolerance broaden. I'm sure when we all think of where we were when we were first out of post-secondary, we've probably noticed that shift in our capacity for the work that we do while still maintaining that level of compassion. Next is supportive professional network. So enjoying collaborating with colleagues or community partners and contributing to that team or those broader systems and being able to lean on those in our professional network, especially supervisors and leaders for support and resources. I know at CASA, we really focus on low impact debriefing, and this model is really great for being able to support our colleagues and our team without experiencing that impact, especially with the subject matter that we cover within our organization. And then structural accommodations. So kind of that flexibility within the workplace, depending on what you have going on. Maybe you have a very heavy session with a client and being able to kind of accommodate your workday a bit, lighten your load for the week if you could, just to help yourself process that. So that may include variance in workload, flexibility in completing work-related tasks, that sort of thing. I know at CASA, we're very fortunate to have a hybrid work model for most of our teams, and I personally find that really beneficial. So as I mentioned, this is not an exhaustive list, but they are some workplace factors that can increase our resilience. So in the next slide here, we're going to talk about some individual strategies and tools. Okay, so what helps? Developing an early warning system that is specific to you. So what are some signs that you or others might notice that your work is impacting you negatively? And how can you encourage those around you to bring up those signs if they notice them? Because sometimes, because it can be such a slow burn internally for us, we don't notice those signs as much, or we're a bit like apathetic towards them. Other people, because they have that outside view, they're not in our head 24/7, they might notice them before we do. And if they can bring those up to us, that is just such a great resource to help us catch that. Engaging in self-care. So I think we've created this romanticized idea of around self-care that should be maybe like a spa treatment or a bubble bath. But sometimes self-care is less glamorous. So maybe it's going to bed early, saying no to plans so you can have a restful evening. Maybe it's doing your laundry because it's taking up space in your mind and causing background stress. But it can also be taking care of your body and mind by eating right, exercising, ensuring that you're getting a good amount of sleep, spending some time outdoors now that we're coming into nice spring weather. And I'm sure most of you agree, having a good counselor yourself for support and debriefing can be incredibly impactful and helpful, especially when elements of our work impact us on a deep level. Accessing supervision. This can be very helpful in both having the ability to debrief, again, focusing on low impact debriefing, but we're still able to process the impacts of our work. Adjustments at work can be helpful, but like I said, when you're able, this can maybe be an extension for a funding report or maybe an additional break after a tough session with a client or a patient. Continuing education is very important too. So taking those opportunities like today for professional development, again, like I mentioned on the last slide, those things can help increase our window of tolerance, and we can become a bit more in tune with ourselves and the impact we feel as professionals. And then lastly, acknowledging and addressing impact. So being aware of the impacts of your work and doing what you need to do to address them. Again, that looks different from person to person. Um, it's been said a million times, but you can't pour from an empty cup. I think a lot of us have probably been given this piece of advice, and we probably give this piece of advice to other people, maybe not to ourselves, but maybe to other people that we're supporting. And, we might struggle to embrace that concept for us, but it really is so true. Um, Last week we had an elder Patsy from Pecani in our office the other week for Red Dress Day, so the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And she shared something that I thought was very insightful. So she had said that the courage we all have as helping professionals isn't the courage to help others, but the courage to help ourselves. Because helping others for most of us joining the session is probably just second nature. It's our natural instinct. But actually taking time, setting boundaries, and taking care of ourselves often isn't a natural instinct for us. And that's where the courage is in our work, being brave enough to take care of ourselves too. Now, Elder Patsy worded it much, much better than I did, but I know for me that's been a big point of reflection this past week. And something that we can use as fuel for self-care is to, especially when self-care doesn't come natural to us, maybe we just feel like we need to help other people constantly. But to remember that helping ourselves is also helping our clients or patients too, because caring for ourselves makes us better able to do the work that we do. So again, much easier said than done, but I hope that through this time we've had together, you've had a renewed sense of importance to take care of yourselves as well. And lastly, I do just want to talk a bit about low impact debriefing because I know I've alluded to it a few times, and this might be a new concept for folks. So low impact debriefing is a technique that can be very beneficial in helping us to receive the support we might need from colleagues or supervisors in managing the impacts of our work. So while also being mindful of the potential impacts of sharing those details too. So for example, in our work at CASA, specifically in work I've done with the Calgary Sexual Assault Response Team prior to being an educator of CASA, we may have had a person we're supporting who has experienced sexual assault and maybe had extensive physical injury. And instead of sharing the in-depth details or extent of injury with a supervisor or someone we're debriefing to, we could just talk about how it impacted us to see that person injured or to know that they'd experienced so much harm. So maybe how it made us feel or where we felt that impact in our bodies instead of reiterating the details. So as it says here, there are four components to low impact debriefing. So the first is self-awareness. It's that self-awareness that we need to even debrief in the first place, right? As well as self-awareness as to why we need to debrief. So those impacts that we're feeling mentally, emotionally, and physically. Fair consent and warning kind of go hand in hand. So, of course, we want to make sure that the colleague or supervisor we are wanting to debrief with even has the capacity for us debriefing at that time, right? We don't know what they have going on in their personal or professional lives too. So, fair warning could look like letting them know what we want to debrief about too. So maybe it's, hey, I was hoping I could debrief with you about a call out I had yesterday for CSART. And then consent would be asking them for consent to us debriefing with them. So do you have capacity for me to debrief with you? Now, remember, if they say no, it could be that they just don't have time, or again, they don't have that capacity. Maybe they don't have that emotional or mental bandwidth, and that is okay. Just like how it is okay that you don't have the mental or emotional bandwidth for someone to debrief with you. So what can be suggested instead is an alternative. Oh, unfortunately, I'm not in the right headspace to debrief with you today. Would you be comfortable debriefing with this person? Or would it be okay if we did that tomorrow? Or if they do consent to us debriefing with them, we then focus on our last component here, limited disclosure. So only giving them the info they need to understand our personal impact. So instead of giving maybe graphic details of every injury or something that the patient had, we can share with them, that they were injured and this made us feel very upset. It made us feel maybe angry or frustrated with the person who hurt them or anyone who uses violence. So again, not focusing on those details, those hard, difficult details, but focusing on, okay, this is the way it impacted me. I think this is why. Let's talk about those impacts. I hope that makes sense for folks. There's a lot of really great resources on low impact debriefing in that model too, if that's something that you want to look up as well. And lastly, just encouraging you to reflect on those questions I asked all of you at the start. Just kind of going forward today, maybe reflecting on these every now and again when times maybe get a little bit tough from an emotional or mental standpoint. When trying to help others. So again, what keeps you interested in your work? What is the best aspect of your job? What is an inspiring moment from your work and what keeps you going when times are hard? So reflect on if any answers have changed or maybe have become a little bit more certain as we've kind of moved through this discussion, and use these answers to help you navigate those difficult times that we all face in the helping profession, and use them to center yourself in those tough times and also in the good times. And again, reflect on the importance of caring for yourself first, because even if you brush it off saying that you want to put others first, remember that classic saying, truly you cannot pour from an empty cup. So helping you is also helping others too. Again, thank you so much for joining, folks. I think Sarah had also put the QR code for this or the link, sorry, for this in the chat. And I believe we're also moving into Q&A now, if folks have any questions.
We are. Thank you so much, Kira, for such an important presentation and one that I think, regardless of the background of the people in this room, we can all have takeaways from. because things like burnout, compassion fatigue, and
Mhm.
understanding self-care beyond like spa days is something so real that we deal with every single day, I think, regardless of profession, but especially in caring professions such as yours and a lot of frontline service workers.
Yeah,
While we
for
wait for
sure.
folks to pop some questions in the chat, I was wondering, what are small things that you can recommend people integrating into their day-to-day, maybe things that you do, or maybe things that are just like these very common practices that we often overlook that might take the edge off before we
Yeah.
get to the point of burnout?
For sure. I think for me personally speaking, I'm a big sleeping person. I very much enjoy my sleep. That is something where when I've like really noticed prioritizing sleep, and sleeping well too, that has been something that's impactful for me. I also find diet is a very important thing too. I think that's just something that very much fuels our bodies and minds as well. And I do think, especially when, depending on our work, we might also be in a job where it's like, oh my gosh, I completely forgot to eat lunch today. And just taking those moments for ourselves, fueling our bodies, and also trying to get outside. I honestly find, I can maybe have a stressful day, and then if I get home from work and take my dog for a quick walk, I do find that it definitely helps improve my mood. Um, and yeah, I think those are kind of the main ones. Another one that someone had told me, and this one I think more so works if you're, I guess, like a visual person and you like the ritual of something. But before you enter your house, or maybe before you even get in your car when you're leaving work, is like just kind of brushing your feet off. So I know before I walk into my house, I just kind of brush my feet off on my like welcome mat, and it just is this physical reminder of leaving anything from my day behind. And that is something that I think just works for me because, again, like I said, I'm a very like ritual-based person. Those practices help me put that thought into action. So different things like that I think can be really beneficial.
I really like that. And those are practices we don't think about, right? Sleep is
Mhm.
just this natural thing we do. I'm also a big sleeper. I love
Yes.
sleep, probably more than anything. And but we don't think about it as an actual practice that we need to be cautious of when we go to bed, thoughtful about how long we're sleeping and how deep our sleep is. Or I haven't tried brushing off my feet, but I like that little ritual that would like
Mhm.
signal to our bodies and our minds we're shifting gears, we're moving towards something else.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, kind of brushing the day off, I guess,
Yeah,
and moving into that, okay, this is my time to relax and enjoy my time away from work.
absolutely. I also really enjoyed that you or the TED Talk that you showed us, where they're
Mhm.
sort of being like, at what point do you stop picking up the phone? At what point do you lose the
Yeah,
ability to hold that space for someone else? And I
yeah.
was wondering, in the line of work that you do, in the line of work that a lot of folks who are here do, how can we start to spot those signs in ourselves that we're running empty on compassion or running empty on the ability to hold space for someone
Mhm.
else?
Honestly, I think one of the biggest things that we need with that is to be able to have a bit more of a reflective stance with ourselves. So if we're noticing, okay, well, I feel like as soon as maybe someone shared something vulnerable with us, we didn't immediately feel empathy, and maybe we normally do, and just being able to spot those differences. I know for me in more of the education stance, because we talk about some really difficult things, and I'm used to talking about sexual violence all day, every day, right? I'm used to that. And I always really try to center myself and remind myself going into a presentation that people that we're facilitating to typically aren't used to talking about sexual violence all the time. So it can be something that's emotional and upsetting. And I need to center myself, I find, for that. I need to have that reflection on my way to the presentation. Um, or as I'm setting up Zoom if it's online. And I think it's really just being able to know what our own baseline is and taking time to reflect on when we're kind of outside of that baseline. Um, and I think that's always been the more difficult thing for me, is like trying to figure out what that baseline is. But as I start to notice that, it's like, oh, okay, I noticed in this presentation I wasn't as empathetic or as aware as I usually am when I'm talking about potential indicators of sexual violence. I wonder why that is, and kind of being able to explore that, and process it as needed too.
Absolutely. And then I received an email from someone because they are having a hard time opening up the Q&A. And they asked me, or sorry, let me pull up that question. The question reads, I've been doing frontline work for a very short amount of time, but I already feel like my cup is empty. What do I do?
That's such a good question. And I have to be honest, when I first started frontline work, like right out of college, I felt like every day I felt like my cup was empty and I really didn't know how to refill that. And again, I think it's also focusing on the fact that, especially when you're new into a field, your window of tolerance for the work you're doing is smaller. I think that's just natural. You have to kind of build capacity for something. It's like how you don't just like immediately go run a marathon. You're kind of building up your stamina for that. So I think the biggest thing is being patient and gentle with yourself. Trying to understand some of the different things you need. So finding those little techniques that are beneficial for you. I know for me, like people were telling me do self-care, and I'm like, I don't know what that means. And some of the things they suggested, it's like, am I broken? Because this isn't working. So finding the self-care tools that work for you. If you're someone who really recharges by being outside, maybe trying to make that a priority. If you're someone who, to feel rested, you need to have like a bit of like a clean home or have a clean space, taking out the time to do that. But I do think it's hard because I would love to give an answer where it's like, this is how you immediately fill your cup. But you do have to figure out what is best for you and prioritize that. But I think the way to do that is by being patient with yourself. Maybe writing down or doing like a voice memo of what your thoughts and feelings are and listening back or reading back to just understand, okay, where am I getting stuck here and how can I move forward and how can I recharge?
I really like that. And I like especially that acknowledgement of like what recharges us individually because it's not always the same, even though we hear
Mhm.
those folks on social media or people being like, oh, this just go to Pilates and you'll be
Yeah,
fine. Just take a
yeah.
spin class. And so it's good to acknowledge really what does work for us
Mhm.
all on our own. Well, I think that answers all the questions. So, Kira, thank you again for such a wonderful presentation. And to all of those here in the room and those watching later, CASA has done, I think, 6 webinars for us now.
Yeah,
And so there's a lot of content to watch, and all of them are just as amazing as today. So, thank you all very much.
thank you.